Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It could be good morning to people if anybody's called in from WA. Hoping everybody can hear me okay. If not, please send me a quick message on the chat box. Welcome to our 8th webinar for the year, and today we want to be talking about the 6 or 7 or 8 P's of emergency planning, and that is prior planning, preparation and practice prevents what kind of poor performance. So welcome everybody, and we might kick off. We'll have a few people continuing to join us. I apologise if you received very late notice of this. Our communications officer has left us, and you don't leave me in charge of the technology. So apologies if you got a late notice, and anybody who's missed, we will have the recording. First up, of course, we'd like to acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of the First Nations people. We recognise their connection to their land and environment and celebrate their care for country for over 60,000 years. We pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and we value their skills and knowledge as our first horticulturalists. And for anybody who wants to know, that beautiful piece of artwork has been gifted to QFVG, Queensland Fruit and Vegetable Growers, and it actually represents the lands and the waters, the crops and the communities, the growing communities and the supply chains. So it's a beautiful piece of work. Okay, let's kick off now. Today, we want to talk about emergency planning, obviously, and why it's important and the value of actually thinking about it early. And given some of the weather predictions, etc., that we've been hearing in the last couple of weeks, now is probably the best time to be thinking about it if you haven't already. So we want to look at the importance of it. We want to just cover off on those weather predictions, what the bomb is saying, etc. I'll just briefly talk about the legislative background. I want to talk about this in terms of taking charge of this issue. So that's, kind of stating your management commitment, establishing your emergency planning committee, including chief wardens, health and safety representatives, first aid officers and the like. We'll then look at how you go about developing a plan, identifying the hazards and the risks at your workplace. We look at things like the likelihood and the impacts and consequences, who does what, and what your plan might include. And then, of course, practice making perfect, because that's one of the key elements of a successful emergency plan. Okay, so what does the landscape look like? You'll probably be all over this, I imagine, but obviously recent years of rainfall and a wet start has meant several parts of the country are now grappling with high amounts of fire fuel, so vegetation, and that includes, as you can see on that map there, most of Eastern Australia, obviously around Alice Springs, that's going to be a problem, and some of South West Victoria. So the predictions are already out with El Nino, and we're going to be preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. When you look at maximum temperatures, they're now saying there's a 60 to 80% chance that we will have above median, maximum and minimum, in fact, temperatures across almost all of Australia. So we're looking at it, I don't know how many degrees, but certainly a warming over the summer, which is only going to fuel those fires. The other thing, of course, is less than medium rainfall is also predicted. So a 60 to 80% chance that it will be less than usual, and certainly greater than 80% chance for southwest and southeast Australia. So what we can see is that the landscape is again kind of ripe for all sorts of bushfire emergencies. I haven't got any information yet around potential for cyclones, but it seems that sometimes those things do go hand in hand, which is why we want to be kind of including things like flooding in our emergency planning. Okay, so as I said, the 7 Ps are prior planning, preparation, practice, preventing poor performance. It's a bit of a cliche, but it kind of works in this environment. So it's about taking charge. It's about understanding that emergency planning is all about preparing for and trying to mitigate as much as you can the impacts of any kind of emergency that you might experience. So that kind of preparedness requires identifying what to do, and how to prepare and how to respond to emergencies. And emergencies, as their name suggests, can happen very quickly. We know how unpredictable things like bushfires and floods are. It involves accumulating all of the necessary knowledge and the skills, disseminating that information about how you go about managing potential emergencies, and providing and allocating adequate resources and training and staff to deal with those emergencies that you've identified as probable or potential on your workplace, at your work sites. The legislative background to this is obviously the Work Health and Safety Act and the Work Health and Safety Regulations. And also I'm mentioning the Australian standards here, 3475, which is planning for emergencies in facilities. And I bring up Australian standards because for Fair Farms participants, they will understand that, that these are audited. So we've included some of the references to the Australian standards where we think they're particularly relevant. That legislation is probably provided under all state legislation, but if not, the national legislation provides coverage for it. They're identical in the Queensland legislation as well. And effectively, an emergency plan must include the following. So emergency procedures. So that is an effective response to an emergency, evacuation procedures where they're required, notifying emergency services at the earliest opportunity, and what you kind of wrap around that, whether you include, you know, there's got to be who does that, responsibilities for it, do you have your GPS coordinates, all of those kind of things that are important in that communication of emergencies. Medical assistance and treatment, and remembering that in any kind of emergency situation, the care for people is your first priority. And again, effective communication between the person or people who are authorised to coordinate or respond to the emergency and all other people at the workplace. And we'll talk about those people shortly. Another of the key elements, of course, is testing. And I think I think that's probably one of the areas where we're lacking, where you need to actually test your emergency procedures to make sure that they work in the environment. It's all well and good to have them written out beautifully and set out in maps, etc. But if they don't work, they don't work. And, you don't want to be finding this out in an actual real emergency situation. And obviously information, training and instruction to all of those workers in relation to implementing those procedures. Now, effectively, you're going to be training all of your workers around your emergency procedures, because those people, who are in charge will get additional training to ensure that they know what their responsibilities are. And the key training for employees is where to go and who to follow. So all of that should be included in terms of your planning documentation and your planning processes. One of the first key elements, I guess, is making that commitment. And, we make a bit of a deal about this in terms of everything related to work health and safety, that you need to lead by example, that you need to state really publicly your clear commitment to managing your work health and safety risks. And that means demonstrating a visible and proactive commitment to all your work health and safety issues. And obviously emergency response is one of those. So open communication, generally speaking, around making your commitment. It is about committing to open communication of those issues with your staff. Consultation with staff around safety issues. I've always said that staff are often in the best position to not only identify hazards and risks, but to offer up practical solutions for how to address those things. So obviously include staff in your consultation when you're thinking about how you're going to address things and develop your emergency plan. Encouragement and leadership in the implementation of your systems and your procedures and any improvements. So again, lead by example. proactive involvement in the direction and support of improved work health and safety performance. So it's a continuous improvement. You know, you can develop your procedures, test your procedures, but you constantly have to review, especially if there are any significant workplace changes taking place, new equipment coming in, new staff coming in who now have to be trained as well. And encouragement, again, of the involvement of those workers in the improvement of that performance. Looking at the Australian standards, 3475 of 2010, they include reference to, and I find the language a little interesting, but nonetheless, an emergency planning committee and emergency control organisation. And it's probably that second term that I'm finding a little curious. But despite the language, effectively, your emergency planning committee is just that. It is responsible for the development, the maintenance, and the implementation of your emergency plan, of your response procedures, and of the training that goes along with that planning. It should have a minimum of 2 members, and you should meet at least annually. So that's a requirement in the Australian standard, and is therefore a requirement under the Fair Farms standard for any of our Fair Farms members. And is something that is usually audited on. The Emergency Control Organisation is not really an organisation as such. It relates to the committee, but effectively it consists of the chief warden and any deputy wardens or floor wardens or other kind of responsible people, including probably the first aid officer, who are appropriate and necessary to an emergency response. So these are the people who, during emergencies, will take precedence over the management structure, over the usual management structure. These are the guys who are in charge. So that would normally include your chief warden. If you're a business owner, you may include yourself on that committee, in that organisation as well. And you might have, you know, a floor warden. So you might have somebody out of the maintenance shed or the machinery shed, you know, committed to that role. You might have somebody in the packing shed committed to that role. So it's about designating responsible people who understand and are involved in the plan, in the planning and the plan, the emergency plan and the evacuation and emergency responses, and who in events of emergencies will take control. So they might be, some of those people might be designated to ring emergency services, some of those people might be designated to do head counts, some of those people might be directed to ensure that machinery is shut down. So you see what I mean. So this is what these terms relate to, about having, you know, a group of people responsible for the development, maintenance and implementation of the plan and of their response procedures. And then on the day or in the event of an emergency, understanding that this group of people, who may consist of less or more, are also the people who are in charge on the day. Now, again, because that's an Australian standard set out under the Fair Farms program and under our standards, that is also something that would be audited through an audit process. So important to understand what's required there. In terms of your chief warden and your deputy wardens or your floor wardens or anybody who really is designated as that kind of role, they have a duty to ensure that the following things are carried out to the highest standards, so that everyone within the facility is kept safe. That is to improve and implement emergency response and control procedures, to take a preventative and proactive approach by regularly assessing the current condition of the workplace and its hazards. So that's that continuous identification of hazards involving staff in that activity. Making staff aware of hazards as well as the control measurements for those hazards and management procedures. So if there are a set of specific controls, whether it's PPE or whether it is no-go zones or whether it is safe work practices, make sure that staff are aware of those. They will lead the emergency and evacuation training, including all of your fire drills. They will know the location of all exits and evacuation routes within the facility, and they will provide assistance to all individuals in the building in the event of an emergency, especially anybody who might have specific needs. So those are the key duties of anybody who is designated as a chief warden, who takes on the role as a deputy or a floor warden, or is engaged, you know, perhaps in that ECO, if that emergency control organisation, which is a bit of a clumsy term. The other kind of important element, of course, is the worker element, and that is seeking the opinions and views of workers on work health and safety issues, which of course should be regular practice. And we've talked about this often and in a range of environments and situations. So health and safety representatives, their role is primarily to liaise with other staff and to identify health and safety issues and convey these to management. So it's just useful sometimes to have somebody operate as that conduit rather than have to deal with a raft of different people at different occasions. They should be elected by fellow staff to represent the views of the staff group, and you can have more than one. You might have, one in the field and one in the packing shed and one in the machinery shed. Somebody who knows that environment, understands, at least has some kind of understanding about the requirements, and is able to and confident enough to bring those issues to management when needed. Adequate resourcing and training. So it's a very good idea if these people are nominated, and certainly under the legislation they are entitled to be trained where they request that training. And there is formal training available for HSRs as well. Again, useful training to have, and will underline your commitment to your work health and safety policy and procedures. Again, record all your consultations, record responses that are provided, and record any actions that are followed up. So keep a record of those consultations and work with those people. Obviously, first aid officers are a key element as well. So the roles and responsibilities include providing immediate and life-saving care before any further support is provided, because remembering that the first focal point for anybody involved in the direction of an emergency procedure is to take care of the people. So that might include moving people to safe places away from immediate danger, and then, of course, administering whatever life-saving first aid can be administered. Obviously reaching the scene, securing the area, making sure that people are safe, making an emergency call. That may be a first aid officer responsibility. It may be a chief warden responsibility. It may be designated to somebody else. Putting the care of injured people first, that's what we talk about. Possibly cleaning up after a mishap, reporting and recording, so making sure that all incidents are properly reported and recorded, and then followed up as needed. If somebody has gone to hospital, you need to follow up and ensure, to see how that person is faring, to ensure that, you can record what's occurred. Again, a part of the first aid officer, the job is generally identifying risks and hazards, and ensuring that first aid supplies are appropriate for the site. So, again, don't have a box full of stuff that you don't need, but do have a box full of stuff that you do need. If that includes things like bandages for snake bites and the like. That they're adequate in number, that the supplies are accessible and readily available to whoever needs them, and that they're kept up to date. Another one of the things that is coming out of audits is out-of-date first aid supplies. So a good idea to keep a register of your first aid supplies and have an annual, at least, checkup of those supplies. Okay, developing your plan. Make sure your plan is relevant to your work site. You can download, WorkSafe Australia has some really good resources available. You can just download. They will give you templates, they will give you checklists, and I've included reference to some of those here. But it needs to relate to your work site, because obviously not all work sites are the same. So consider those matters that are relevant to your work site. So the nature of the work that's carried out, the nature of the hazards at the workplace, the nature and the size of the location of the workplace, the number of buildings, etc. The remoteness. So how far away are you from emergency services? How likely is it to take fire services or ambulance to get to your place? And do you need, therefore, to have heightened resources at your place to address some of those issues? The number and composition of the workforce. So how many people have you got? Have you got sufficient trained people to adequately manage the size of your workforce? And that includes labour hire workers, visitors, other contractors, etc. And bearing in mind, of course, that you may have to develop some special consideration if you do have workers who travel long distance for work, who work alone. So if they're in remote locations, and obviously people who may have special needs in evacuation, etc. So make it relevant to your workplace. identify, and that includes identifying the types of emergencies that could arise at your workplace. So, do you have lots of dry vegetation around you? Is fire a potential? Do you have a lot of machinery, a lot of gas tanks, a lot of fuel around? Is it properly protected and housed? Is it away, from other areas? What is the likelihood of flood? Do you have creeks and rivers, etc.? Are you in one of those kind of zones? I have memories of the Lockyer Valley from 10 or 12 years ago, and Grantham. Have you got any risk of explosion? Have you got, is there likelihood of a medical emergency, or is there need for a rescue, a helicopter rescue, for example? Are people working in, very remote locations? Are there likely to be incidents with hazardous chemicals? You've already, you'll understand your obligations around storing and labelling of chemicals, of ensuring proper access to the MSDSs, and of ensuring proper access to things like eye washers, etc. Even things like bomb threats and armed confrontations, dissatisfied staff, God forbid. And other kind of natural disasters, if you're prone to things like earthquakes. I know it sounds weird talking about earthquakes and tornadoes, but we do have them. So your emergency plan needs to be based on that practical assessment of the hazards that are associated with your workplace and the work activity that goes on at your place, and the potential consequences of any emergency that is likely to occur. So relevance is a really key issue. When we think about the harm and the likelihood and the consequences, we think about kind of a risk matrix. So what is the harm that the hazard or the risk is likely to cause or could cause? So what kind of harm would a chemical spillage cause, etc.? What is the likelihood of this happening? Think about, it's very likely, or it's highly likely, or it's not really likely. Who are the persons who are going to be at risk? Who's it going to affect in the immediate and surrounding areas? What are the likely consequences of an accident like this? Again, what are the likelihood? I've already said that. And what are your existing control measures? And a bit of a review about whether they actually do still address the likely potential consequences of an incident. Okay, so that's all about this kind of, and this isn't the best example of it. You will have seen probably better ones, but this is kind of talking about identifying what the risk is, whether it's a facility fire, flood, forest fire, a bushfire, hurricane, cyclone, things like that. What is the possibility of it? Is it not likely to happen? Is it pretty low? Is it a medium? Is it high, or is it very high? What is the likely impact of it? This talks about providing scores. I think the other element of this is what are you going to do in the event of these things happening? So this is how you, kind of begin to think about your plan, especially for your work site. And to give you a better kind of picture of what you need to include. Okay, so talking about inclusions, obviously things like emergency contact details for those key personnel. So that's, fire wardens, floor wardens, first aid officers. The other thing is contact details for local emergency services. It's also a really good idea to have your GPS coordinates, especially if you are operating in a remote area. And bearing in mind, and I've mentioned this once or twice previously, we know of at least one situation where the fire department was directed to the school road, which was not actually the name of the road. Everybody just called it that. So GPS locations provided to emergency services are a really good idea. So keep them at hand and allow people to do those, especially if you are in remote communities. Alerting people to an emergency. So what kind of siren or alarm bells do you have? How are those kind of emergency alerts operated, and who does it? The evacuation procedures, of course, a map of the workplace illustrating the location of fire extinguishers, hoses, equipment, exits and assembly points. Triggers and processes for advising neighbouring businesses. So if anybody is close, do you need to let anybody else know what's happening on site if anything's likely to spread? Post-incident follow-up processes. So again, you need to get together after the event and review those plans, procedures, check on people and make sure that those things work properly for you at the time. and check that the procedures for testing the emergency plan, including the frequency of testing, you should include those in the plan. So you should, in fact, make a statement within your plan about these will be tested at least annually or more often. Whenever you think it is, and that you keep a record of that testing, and that record of that testing needs to include a record of all the people who were involved in that testing. And that means on the day that you do your fire drill and you evacuate, you have to have people who were present sign that they took part in that activity. Now, again, that's another audit requirement under the Australian standards. So particularly for people undertaking fair farms, that activity is going to be fairly important, that when you do your practice run, that you record who was there and have them sign off that they were involved. Sorry, okay, inclusions, yes, that's right. Okay, so I thought this was a rather good diagram. It's just an example of an evacuation plan for a facility. So, whether that's your packing shed, machinery shed. So an emergency evacuation plan is a set of procedures and also a map which will help facilitate safe evacuations in the event of workplace emergencies. So I thought this was a fairly good example. It has the the various kind of indices there that tell us what means what. So this is the kind of thing that the auditor would be looking at, and this is the kind of thing that would probably fairly well meet the standards. So you can see it says where all of the, the assembly points are, where first aid is located, fire extinguishers and the like. So where you can develop your own map that identifies all of those things. Okay, access to your emergency plan. So you should have the emergency plan, or at least a summary of those key elements should be readily accessible by workers. And, it's a good idea to have that on display in the workplace, whether that's in your lunchroom or, wherever workers meet at the beginning or the end of the day. And training obviously is vitally important. So training, workers must be adequately trained in those procedures. This should occur at induction. So there should be an overview. Always when you bring new staff on board, you should conduct at least one practice run at least once a year. And there should be regular mention of it at regular intervals, for example, at toolbox meetings. Arrangements for information, training and instruction must be set out in the emergency plan itself. So you might make reference to it within your emergency plan. So training has to include, as we've talked about, testing the plan, so practicing those evacuations, identifying assembly points, location and use of emergency equipment, first aid arrangements, and how to safely shut down that that machinery. And again, bang, 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 on I go, but it is about practice making perfect, and it is a requirement under both the work health and safety regulations and the Australian standards that employers test these emergency plan and evacuation procedures. So they should be tested at least annually. It can be as simple as thinking of a scenario and then applying the plan through it. However, you really need to stage at least annually one mock emergency. So whether that's a fire, out of the packing shed, undertake that activity, take it seriously, review how those things work, make sure that the people in charge know what they have to do, make sure the employees follow instructions clearly, do the sign off at the assembly point, and then review that procedure to ensure that it worked and identify any gaps in that procedure. Again, keep your records of testing, including all those workers, and as we've said, conduct a review at the end of that. I referred earlier to WorkSafe Australia, which has, this is just drawn from their emergency plans fact sheet. And one of the things that forms a part of that really useful resource is a checklist. And I'd recommend at the very least that you go to that resource at the end of today's session and have a look at that checklist. And that will give you a fairly good benchmark outcome to identify where you might need to improve your practices. And certainly if you don't have an emergency plan already in place, this will give you some pathways to how to develop one. So the key messages are know your own environment and map it out. So identify potential hazards and the associated risks to those hazards. Look at your risk matrix, think about the likelihood of those things occurring, the potential consequences and the harm of those things occurring, the potential consequences and the harm that could happen. Don't forget, appoint your chief wardens, an emergency planning committee, if that's what you need to do, and make sure that those people receive appropriate training. So that is a full knowledge of what's required under the Work Health and Safety Act and where required under the Australian standards. Nominate, and this will be part of the Chief Warden's responsibility potentially, nominate your emergency control organisation. So again, all of those people who will be involved in directing action in the event of an emergency. And remember, the size of your workplace is important. If you're only nominated one Chief Warden to oversee an emergency and you've got a whole set of buildings and work sites, you're going to be in trouble. So you need to nominate people who can take charge at the time in the spot. And even if it's to tell people to stand still or to walk up to the road, make sure that these people are in place. Develop your emergency plan. Again, the templates are available. Head to Work Health and Safety Australia. If you haven't got something in place, get something in place. It is a legislative requirement, so if you don't have it, you'll be in a world of pain if something goes wrong and or if Work Health and Safety inspectors turn up, and certainly if you're undertaking an audit with the Fair Farms program. Test your procedures. Again, make sure that you test them to make sure they work, record all your activities and review and amend as needed. Okay, not sure what to do or where to go, talk to us. The Fair Farms program has a clear set of standards across all employment and work health and safety provisions, and we can run you through this stuff. We have a full training program available, both online modules as well as a one-on-one training. We have the manual established, which covers all of the standards and provides some templates that you would need to meet your requirements. And if you have to undertake an audit, we can assist you with a pre-audit checklist to ensure that you also meet those requirements. So there's lots of help available when you sign up to be a Fair Farms member. Just a quick reminder, we continue to be all around the country. So I have been invited back to Tasmania, which is wonderful. Hello to our Tasmania people, to attend some more workshops in the week beginning 11th September. So we'll get that confirmed. Of course, we'd love to have you at our Fair Farms National Conference on the 20th of October. That's a really going on. I'll talk about that shortly. We'll be at the NFF National Conference in Canberra. We'll be at Wahoo, which is the West Australian Horticulture Update. And I've also been invited to attend the Citrus Australia Forums throughout October, November. In South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and WA, and the National Conference in 2024. In terms of our conference, please join us. We'd love to have some growers along to our conference where we're looking at perspectives and solutions around fair and ethical sourcing for Australian horticulture. We've got some great speakers. We've got a lot of peak industry bodies who are joining us there. So it's a great opportunity to have some lively discussion and even debate, if you like, about ethical solutions, ethical sourcing. Okay, that's me for the day. I'm only 2 minutes overdue. I will check through the chat box here, and here we go. Yes, the video. Trained first aid is required to complete annual CPR training, or is 3-year first aid? Well, that's a very, very good question. My understanding is CPR training is an annual requirement. And first aid certificate is a 3-year requirement. We would probably be recommending an annual update of that training. Again, it goes along with the annual planning, it goes along with the annual testing of procedures, and it's fairly important to keep up to date with those skills. So I think that we would be recommending that training where applicable. Okay, look, thanks everybody for joining again today. I really appreciate you joining us. If there's anything, we'll be making this available again, this recording available to all those who've registered and not been able to join us. Any queries, questions, comments, please just let us know. Enjoy the rest of the week and we'll see you in a month. Bye for now.